Okay. I think we should get started. Normally we wait a little longer because we have quite a few speakers today. We should get started, and hopefully the banging outside stopped. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here. Do you not hear me? Barely. Barely? Can you pump it up a little? How's that? Okay, thank you. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. My name is Victoria Vesna, and I chair the Department of Design Media Arts and have recently established a center called Art Science, which is meant to bring people together from many different walks of life to talk about different subjects, but try to ground it in projects. So an event like this hopefully would evolve into an actual project. It could be an art project, it could be a science research, it could be a theoretical paper, but some kind of project is what we're interested in doing. The way this event was initiated was actually through Professor Roy Ascott, who's a visiting professor in our department from the UK. And he's a theoretician, an artist who will speak in a little bit. When he said he's coming, and I asked him to give a talk, he asked me, please no, no more talks, can we have some kind of discussion? And so here it is. We have not a dialogue, but a polylogue. We have people from many different disciplines, which a lot of times reminds me of working with people from many different countries. And you may approach that as a tourist and enter the country, pick up a souvenir, and then go home and have a memory of that. Or you may get really interested and learn how to understand the language and culture a little better. Or you may get really into it and learn the language, maybe marry into the culture. And it's a similar thing in a university, for instance. As you travel through different disciplines, you're traveling through different cultures, languages, and it takes an effort. But regardless, the kind of situation we find ourselves in, whatever field we're in, we have to look at things from many different facets. I always imagine kind of a diamond, and you look at different facets of the diamond. Only when you see the whole diamond can you have a sense of what it's about. So, but having said all that, there's also issues around what do you do when you work within a certain culture but you don't agree with the authorities who are determining how the social functions work? And what do you do when you don't know the language? And what gets lost in the translation when you have a translator? And how do you coordinate all this? So when we come together today, there's actually two books that I was reading at the same time. And I don't know if you do the same, but I actually read a few books at the same time. They're quite different, but at the same time, there's a lot of overlaps that happen in these two books. There's a lot of gaps, contradictions, and also space for the kind of discussion that we're talking about. The first one is Dalai Lama's new book, The Universe in a Single Atom, The Convergence of Science and Spirituality, in which he discusses his personal interest in science as a young boy. It's actually a fascinating story. And then goes on to talk about his discussions with neuroscientists and scientists and just fascination with science. And the book on the right is by Roy Ascott, recently put together an edited volume of artists and theorists who came together and started thinking about how nanotechnology, biotechnology, and genetic engineering has influenced and is influencing how we perceive our reality. So modern cosmology and physics emphasize the interdependence of complex systems on scale from microscopic to macroscopics. Genetics reveal the underlying shared genetic identity, not of all human beings, but the genetic relatedness of everything on Earth. The current scientific discoveries reconnect science to a number of spiritual and philosophical value systems. And then the question, of course, is where do artists fit in all this? So I would like to say also that the people who are coming together today to talk, a few I've actually worked closely with. Roy Ascott, the longest, we met in 1986 in Venice Biennale when he was part of an exhibition called Art and Science. And then later I became part of a PhD program that he established in the Planetary Collegium. And then Jim Jimzewski, a nanoscientist who joined this campus in the year 2000, and we collaborated on an exhibition together and started thinking about how art and science can inform the way we're thinking, but how we actually bring in spirituality. We did an exhibition in 2003 when we met Losang Wanchuk, the Venerable Losang Wanchuk, who is an American and the tour director of the Tibetan monks for about 16 years. Our intent was to somehow connect the East and the West, the philosophies that come together, and he has played a critical role as a guide and a translator with a lot of compassion for our ignorance, for the difference in culture. And he has studied with the Tibetan master Kyabe Dzong Rinpoche since the 1970s. So he truly crosses over the two worlds, and Losang is sitting here at the end. Barbara Fields is a new acquaintance, but there's an absolute connection. Her brother was a student and now a colleague of mine, and we somehow crossed paths recently, and I'm really happy to be here, to have her here. And then Siggy Hales, who's actually doing something very interesting in the neuroscience center, actually developing mindful awareness and integrating it into a scientific methodology, which is quite brave, I have to say. Anyway, so to end with, I'd like to just say that when I called Losang and told him of this idea that started off with just doing a conversation, he said that it's a good idea, but that I really need to think about what is the purpose of this, and to ask hard questions or questions that I'm really interested in, but that would reflect the audience's interest too. And I thought about it, absolutely agreed that this kind of conversation can very quickly become esoteric, metaphysical. We can all feel better about ourselves and leave the room. So I did think about the questions. I decided to format it as follows. I will ask each of the participants 2 questions, which they already know, and they will individually talk, and then we will all come here and have a discussion with you as well. So we'll start with Chuni Lobsang Jimba Rinpoche, who is accompanied with the Venerable Lama Phunchto. Maybe I sit here the best. Rinpoche was born to a family of Tserang Bagto and Drolma on the 7th of July 1936 with 2 other twin brothers simultaneously. This auspicious sign of giving birth to 3 sons at one time was thought to be a sign of an evil or propitious omen between good and bad neighbors. His parents encountered various sufferings, and before long, Reteng Rinpoche, the king of Tibet, made a pilgrimage to Lama Latso, the Oracle Lake, in central Tibet. There he had a vision of the triplets, and upon his return summoned all of them to his oratory. After 3 days of deep spiritual investigation, the three brothers were all recognized as important reincarnations. Each was given the title of Tulku, meaning reincarnated High Lama. Having been recognized as highly important reincarnated Lama at such a young age, Rinpoche began his studies at the Great Garden Monastery at the age of 7. I have, sorry, here we go. Under the guidance of some of the foremost masters, he studies all 5 major Buddhist sutric treatises for almost a decade. After the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1959, he followed in the footsteps of His Holiness Dalai Lama. He fled with his eminent Dzong Rinpoche to asylum in India, along with 300 other geishas and tulkus. Under the guidance of the Dalai Lama, he spent years in the Dal House in northern India, continuing to train in Buddhist studies and helping to restore the lost sacred scriptures. There he studied Tibetan literature, English and Hindi, and was asked to run the school of Punchok Ling, a newly established rehabilitation Tibetan settlement in the state of Orissa, where he taught prayer, recitation, ritual, and all aspects of Buddhist thought. He counseled both his students and townspeople on the art of keeping one's mind in a state of peace, and used his spiritual powers for healing both physical and mental ailments. By the age of 35, Rinpoche practiced and studied so vigorously that he earned himself the highest geisha degree of Larampa, that's equivalent to a PhD in Buddhist studies. Since his retirement, he has been tirelessly and constantly engaged in various spiritual practices. In spite of having deep spiritual knowledge, Rinpoche has been keeping a low profile and continues to dedicate most of his time to austere spiritual practice. Next to him is Venerable Phunchto, who is a translator, who was born in Bhutan. He began school at a very young age, and in 1987 became a monk in Bhutan, where he studied elementary Buddhist teachings. In pursuit of more advanced and intensive teachings, he went to India in 1990 and enrolled in the Gaden Shartse monastery. He worked in the Shartse library for 2 years and then became the assistant to His Eminence Kensur Rinpoche Jamba Jeshe. Together they have traveled to Europe, Singapore, Malaysia, and the United States, during which time Wen Phuncho was the translator. Additionally, he helped to coordinate and acted as a translator on the 8th World Tour, Sacred Earth and Healing Arts of Tibet. Currently, he is involved in the development of the Pokang Kangsten. Please welcome them. So the 2 questions that I have for the Rinpoche, the first one is, although popular in the West, Tibetan Buddhism is a very complicated teaching that is culturally specific. Can you explain to us your approach in working with this extremely materialistic social realm in the West?
Bevegi chötede ta shiradi chuburji de chijege de bebe chötede chuburji tungu yusres de chubu yo manas korba kinjugdana korba kor tambone dine shidenrup de ja tambodinro dine ma ja grindo de ma jugdana dine korba de ta jinro de mejiyo. Dine mejaja 강가에 톱도 저는 충도 가버지 그런 권용도 가버지 통해서 지들었어.
First of all, I would like to clear the misunderstanding about the Tibetan Buddhism, because sometimes people often have conceptions about Tibetan Buddhism is kind of like a very complicated, and it also happened this kind of like confusion because when people they try to take a little bit from many parts of the Tibetan Buddhism, then when you try to gather all together to apply into your practice, then it becomes lots of complications and confusions. But if you really go in step by step, every steps, then it is really a well-organized and is really profound practice. There's no complications or no confusions. Only if you take a little bit of teachings from everywhere, then it makes a confusion and complications.
Kamba thoda perishana, kamba thoda chambuche yobayina, kamba thoda tambona lado, tena maji tegnana, atamu chamburjo, thoda nyebale ado, na atamu tadana suzuki, what in the jigya to the kaleke yomaris. Tinde mejebje, kangane tupta kanga miche amjonya to the tene trubris tunguris, teaching yomaris.
So that's why we encourage the people to practice is if it is a multi-story building, then one has to try to look from the first ground and then second ground and look over slowly. Then you will know that the difference and how it looks, the whole structure. But all of a sudden, if you go zigzag and way up, may bring some difficulty or problem. So similarly, and when we practice also, if we know step by step to practice properly, then there won't be any kind of confusions.
Tene dilopjan di chebegi chetuki tene samlaya. Ko lopjan di chetuki samlaya tagi jejeng. Sem kyoba segi chigmana. Tene ko le labu tungres. Tene pendo yobde hagore. Tene demejerje kangali ta phate rusem chumela phate tene chupurji ta konyo purjingores tene mares.
And also the whole purpose of engaging into Tibetan Buddhism or spiritual practice is whenever you study or apply into one's practice, one has to analyze that whether that whatever one is practicing and learning, whether it is helping us to transform the inner value or not. And then if it helps you to transform, then you promote that practice. If it doesn't help you to transform your inner, the mind stream or your character through your body, speech and mind, then you have to avoid it and find another one. So that's how that one has to analyze carefully. And also, one of the most important thing is when you practice, never try to look at the faults or others, whether by applying spiritual practice into one's own path, whether someone is transforming or not, whether something that you are going to achieve or not. When this kind of expectations, if you practice, then it will bring you a lot of confusions and problems.
And how it will benefit, for example, the Tibetan Buddhism when it comes to the West country, the America or Europe, how it will adapt and how you can cope to practice properly. I'm going to explain about it. The pendo the carrying to semlea te. The semlea can jarbache, semgate the Kuniba Jujuta, semlea, Samba Nambate, Mava Susu, Samba somebody, Legage, Tene, Tiche Shana, Tene, Pebegi Chete, Tene, Yorobia, Pendo Cheshe to Yoris. Penjo the Yorbres, Kaneki or Penjo the Yorb, Semji Kaneki Yoris. Semlea, Tene. 동해게 동해다디 동해데 그냥 요래서는 생방 냠바데 용거데 생방 냠바데 바 매바 소야게 탑시디 수수기 제바 있나 되냐 벽에 쳐대 유럽에 펜도 용하데레스.
And so, how to, first of all, like how to listen the practice, the Tibetan Buddhism is, for example, one of the high master came from Tibet, like in a Western country. Then, first of all, one must listen the talk or teachings carefully and try to think constantly about it, and whatever that one has achieved or understood from the teachings that one has received, one has to apply into your practice. And that practice, whether that practice is helping you to transform into a better person, then that you have to take into your practice. So otherwise, if it doesn't make sense, if it doesn't helping, then one has to discard that and try to find the other way, because this is the greatest the part that one has to make sure about. Like whenever you receive any teachings, you have to make sure that how it applies, because in the material wise, like though in the West, like there's a lot of wealth and positions and everything, but right now that their whole purpose of practicing or engaging or receiving the teaching is to help us to overcome the inner suffering, because like the true material things are not the true source to give us the inner happiness. And whatever the suffering or challenges that we are facing within inside, it is all because of the negative intentions, like anger, hatred, desire, all these deluded delusions. Because of this, that we are facing all kind of daily sufferings or challenges. In order to encounter those, like only by the means of receiving the proper teachings, then it will help us to encounter and will help us to transform in the inner happiness or achieve the inner happiness.
시대 용거도나 근데 잠반이 고야기 대치우라면 세례기 딱제 지구래 딱제 전에 다 돌나나 소소게 띠냠내 지구래서야 돼 지금 먼저 세례다 지금 놓어야 돼 다처럼 님은 지기 나와 지도도 로지도도 잠반이지 아버 고나 소소를 핑계도와 시대 용거도 용거면도 현라 시대에 债도도 때문에 때다 되네 하고 그래.
And since we call these days as the religious science or the philosophers, so in order to prove that whether that whatever one is practicing or applying a spiritual practice, for example, the Buddhist, the Tibetan Buddhism, so one has to analyze, for example, try to meditate, try to practice on generating love and compassions. And like, for example, the true meaning of love means when you wholeheartedly wishing all the sentient beings and environment to be happy, and you actively engage into an action, is called love. Compassion means when you wholeheartedly wishing all the sentient beings and environment to overcome from their sufferings, and you actively engage into an action. So try to meditate and apply in your daily life, and at least try to practice for about a month. Then try to analyze that whether by practicing love and compassion, whether it is it is giving you the inner peace or not, how it is helping you and transforming you or not. It will definitely give you some solutions about it. So this way, that since we are in the religious science, that you have to analyze by practicing on generating love and compassion, then obviously it will come to an end that it will give you inner peace and happiness and joy within inside. So that's how that this is the time that we have to analyze practicing like that.
the Nushu the Yad change, then the Suzuki shitted Parchi, then the Shitty Chagar. Chimobayaja, Chimba in the Samba de Dukja, Janya, the Samba Pedro, the Tevagina, then a Pandoya Mothers. Kunyam Doyam, the Toto, the Matuchi, Chichiluba, Nuya Mothers. Chi Mobayaja, Chambata, Semgo Mobayaja, Chamba Nation, Kunichikachiba Dotobaina, Shitty Hapa to give it. The Mavaja, Chi Mobayaja, Nagi Sympathy Yaja, Manatan, and Nyaka Kangatane got it.
So therefore, right now, our greatest challenge and the problem in this the new generation, the new age is, like, though we have a lot of development in the materialistic world, but we lack the inside value, that is the spiritual background, our generating good heart. So that's why, like, since we don't balance these two, the material is so high and inner value is so low, the challenges then starts the problem. So the more the material is so high and the inner value is so low, so that's why it contradicts. So therefore, like if we really analyze carefully, actually this material and the spiritual doesn't contradict each other's. Only things we don't balance together. So we have to balance generating and like raising the inner value of generating good heart or love and compassion. If you generate that higher, so the more the material is well developed, if you have the inner value, actually that will be the highest, the joy, because you have the combinations of both. But if the material itself won't give us the inner peace, that's why, like right now, our greatest challenge is we don't balance. So that's why it is how that if we generate and balance the inner value of generating good heart, generating love and compassion, and if we balance, it will give you the inner peace and happiness and joy. So that's why sometimes, like when we lack the understanding about the spiritual practice and these material things, then we think that like material, if we have lots of material thing, then we will be happy. That is totally misconceptions. And even if you think that without having a spiritual background and if we will be happy, that is also not true. So that's why it has to be balanced. Otherwise, like we will always have some kind of hungry inside and we will never be peace. So that's why like always has to balance in these two. Sometimes people often like misunderstand about this.
American liadine semki nezuge semki tsiri semki shiti yonage de opjan yabuchebe na che ngobe yaketa dodabate de yonde pebash hadane de
So that's why sometimes, from my own point of view, like in America, like it is so well developed. One has every material thing that whatever you need, you get it. But along with that, if you train, if you learn about how to generate the inner value of love and compassion and good heart, then America will be the most happiest the continent, because you have the other part is already developed. Only things you need the inner parts to develop.
Okay, second.
The second question. So, my second question is in relation to the idea that we accept the scientific realm and the materialistic Western way of thinking and methodologies. But are there parallels to this kind of self-deception in the spiritual or esoteric realm, where we think we're developing spiritually, but we're actually strengthening our egocentricity? And how would we know the difference, even with people who are spiritual leaders?
다치 뭐뭐 야제 같이 침바단지 수수기 샘기 내주디 야제 미심자 대도도 샘미 내주디 바마 쪼고 제도도 되네 나세야기 되네 나세야지 그 속도 같이 삼제제 나도 단단한 나발에 나이 삼사지네 나 지지주 고유 나 지지주 중고유 아 고모 몸지고 전도 몸지고 강바지고 강바니지 고유사데 가르 고유서 거라서나 나 생각이 숙체 답이긴데 가만히 연이 배조자요만 되네 나 생각이 숙체 답이긴데 되네 되네 차제 되네 섬대 체라 되네 나제 체라 되네 나제 체라 된 누구 알아 나 생각이 가봐도 따져지다 되네 계속 통그래서
About this one, like the one of the the issues happen like even one may consider as a spiritual practice, but if they lack the understanding about I or me, and then along with that, like when we are along with the material things, so many material things, so suddenly that our desire is so strong since we are in the world of desire. So the more we are adopt or along with when we are with the desire, then the nature of desire is never satisfying. That means it will create more and more desire. So obviously, like there will be a grasping like an I, because the lack of understanding about the I, then obviously to fulfill I, then it desires. So the key to grasp I is called the ignorance. We call the beginningless ignorance. And ignorance is the key to grasp those things, and then you want more and more. Though in reality that this matter like house or money or position is not it doesn't exist in a reality, but because of the ignorance that it grabs and it wants more and more, and it never becomes like satisfied. So that's how, like when we analyze about like a grasping towards I, though when we look at vaguely, we think that this is me, but if you really analyze carefully, it can be very, very shocking, because we won't point out that who is I also. So that's how sometimes we like misunderstand about I.
근데 매직이 배시잖아. 매직이 소송 걸어야 작바징도 쉬베이나. 나를 잡아 쉬고 삼바지기 컨트롤 학바지 랑고요. 컨트롤 학바 랑고요. 삼로 단다. 나 생각에 가바 쉬도 걸어 쉬도 하는 것 거든 나 말아봤대. 나 세야든 거든 나 말은 걸어 쉬어 봐. 나를 쉬도 좀 걸어 쉬어 맞아. 나를 쉬어 말아 봐. 근데 라바지 쉬베이네. 라바지 나를 쉬고 삼제 친구들. they lack of us. Then there's some time to the nothing at the Kawato, Susu Sambeg, but Seshava. I take it, Susu, I get it, Susu, the Surney, then delay chapter, the church of Seshava, the Mataja, nothing at the Pataja, she had to do Takavando, the Lavade Mare, Gone Mare, Mare, then the Kaibaba, then the Mangala dinge. 또 강가 초파티제 강바다 라바다 티제 강가티네 나이나네 테나 메레덩에 또 딱자 야고 치다티네 테 님부 메정을 치기 님부 메정을 지 통그레스 근데 다도나 테네 삼로 딱자 야고 치다티네 나제다 콘도다 테네 말레지 중나 사야기다 티제 마촌 그레스
like for example, like a person like who had a strong ego like me, I, then all of a sudden if someone who like hit me, like for example with the sticks on my head, like then immediately the anger will arise that he or she hit me on my head. So, but a person who really understands about that the I doesn't exist of its own, it is the fabrications of all the parts of my body that is called I, then immediately it will have a person who knows about the I doesn't exist of its own will have a thought about like how, why should I get angry with it? Because the one who get angry is like I'm angry, but I is not angry. is because the one who used the stick to hit on my head, the head is not me who hit me. It is the head should get pain, but not I. So if you get a hit on my hand, then hand should get pain, not me. So that way, like when we carefully analyze, there's no need to be angry. There's no need to say that I was hurt. Because the hand was hurt, not I. So that way, like one has to carefully, like when you analyze, then it obviously will help us to understand that there's no need to be angry with that person because they didn't hit me, they hit my hand. So that's how that a person who understands about the I doesn't exist of its own will immediately will help them to understand about how to minimize their ego, minimize their desire and hatred and anger. That's how they practice.
Mikanga no Julia Suzu Sugute, the Jakangai, Kamjet, the no Julia ship Nana. Ship Suzu Subuta, the Jakanga Chatan, they are of us. Then did you know yoga about them? Namindo at the do. The Kawaya and Nadi. Subutu, Gordon, you are a company, you are a Kanga, the Kamna Luce Shagdoas. To do Namindoas. The button, some lay of time to attend Subulu and Namara, then the Naran and sing it and Nate, some of the Maran or some that to chop origin, some logitan, the regeneration, and do some Changmar base.
So that's why our greatest misconception is like we think this whole fabrications of all the blood, fluid, bones and everything is me, I. Right? If you carefully analyze, it is all the fabrications of many parts and it is not I, it's the parts. So if it is so, then like for example a dead body, everything is there, the head is there, I, everything is there, but still that's not I, it is just a dead body lying on a coffin. So that's how that when we carefully, when we analyze, then even the body is not an I, then where is I? So that way, like when we analyze, this will help us to understand that I is not just a body, but there is something behind. It is the fabrications of many parts, and there are something behind that too. So that way that one has to analyze.
Then Nakala Sapoyota, Nachi Chiguda, Samba Pata, Batamji Remato Chigi, then a Mindo Samba Teltana, then a Chakshinda, the Gigmatis.
So after analyzing that I exists only because of the fabrications of many parts and particles of a body, but in reality that I doesn't exist of its own. So why should I be desired to this material thing? Because the true material thing, like wanting positions or wealth or money, is not the true source to bring inner peace, and also it's not the true source of happiness. So that way, like if one begin to understand that I doesn't exist of its own, then immediately that desire will be less, and ego or hatred, anger will be less, and that will bring us the self, like a contentment, and that's how that a true practitioner will try to search that I and balance with the material environment.
Dudin Chame, dear man. Dudin Chame.
Okay.
Dudin Chame. Marbe.
You can sit back there if you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, okay.
Our next speaker is, if you'd like to stand, our next speaker is Roy Ascott, who's the founder and president of the Planetary Collegium and director of Kaya Hub. He's a professor of technoethics at the University of Plymouth in England and a visiting professor here at UCLA. He's held numerous academic positions, including vice president and dean of San Francisco Art Institute, professor of communication theory, University of Applied Arts in Vienna, chair of fine art, Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and president of the Ontario College of Art in Toronto. His first appointment was in London at the Ealing School of Art, where he established the Radical Ground Course. Later in London, he taught at the Slade, St. Martin's, and the Central. He has served on the Art and Media panel of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Arts Council of England. Ascott has shown at the Venice Biennale, Electra Paris, Ars Electronica Linz, V2, Holland, Milan Triennale, Biennale de Mercosul, Brazil, European Media Festival, and has initiated a number of online projects, including the seminal Le Plaisir de Texte. He is considered the father of telematic art, and his focus is on art, technology, and consciousness. He's the founding editor of Technoethic Arts, a journal of speculative research published by Intellect Books in England, and he serves on the editorial boards of Leonardo, LEA Convergence, and Digital Creativity. He has advised new media centers and festivals in many parts of Europe, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Japan, Korea, the USA, as well as CEC and UNESCO, and convenes the annual International Consciousness Reframed conferences. His publications are Engineering Nature, Telematic Embrace, Visionary Theories of Art, Technology, and Consciousness, edited by Edward Shanken in the University of Berkeley, Technoetic Arts, Art, Technology, and Consciousness, Reframing Consciousness, and in general is a tour de force in bringing arts into the new age, into the 21st century, and looking at ways that art can play a major role with scientists and with artists playing a more powerful role rather than just being in the gallery system. And so Roy has written recently an article that I based my questions on for him. I wanted to know what strategies you would employ to create an environment in which artists can play a role in breaking this materialistic bond that you talk about in your essay, and while engaging the material realm. So it's a kind of a double bind that we find ourselves in. That's the first question, please.
Could we have both questions? Yeah.
That's a good idea. The second one is that Roy is very much an advocate of artists working with scientists, and he certainly has supported our efforts in this direction. But it's a fact that we work in very different social, political, and financial contexts, extremely different. So the question is actually on a practical level. How do you actually imagine that artists can play a role in a situation where a lot of times we're called the ballerina dancing with the elephant?
Right, okay. Well,
welcome,
thanks.
Roy Ascott.
Thanks, Victoria. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So, well, I'd like to set first the context in which I could answer the question as far as I can, and it's the techno-cultural context. That I'd like to make sort of 5 points. That first of all, our media now, the new media we use is moist media. That's to say it's a convergence of the dry, silicon dry digital media and wet biological systems. These things are coming together now for artists as for others. Our mind is technoetic. That's to say that we have all kinds of computer systems and technological systems to extend the way that the mind and the senses perceive and can analyze and can process information. Our body is transformable, And our planet is now almost entirely telematic. But with all of this, and considering these sort of questions, I'd like to point out that there's no meta-language or meta-system that places one discipline or one worldview automatically above all others. So we're absolutely alone in the world now. We have to work out all our values by interaction and so forth. And science itself, in my view, has absolutely no authority whatsoever outside of its rather narrow reductionist mechanistic remit. And so I believe very much in us working with science, but I think science needs our help. And so I would say, in the current climate, where art and science projects are proliferating all over the West, ask not what science can do for art, ask only what art can do for science. Because when you think of it, dark matter and dark energy form something like 97% of the cosmos. We know nothing about 97% of the cosmos. We call 78 or something like that percent of DNA junk DNA because we have absolutely no idea how it functions. We have no idea where the mind is located, how it arises. We don't know what qualia are. We don't understand how we smell a rose and how we see the pinkness of its petals. And we're very far away from understanding what we are, whether we are in fact light, a field, whether information, whether molecules and atoms and what atoms are. So one way or another, science is in a bad state, and on top of that, the quantum scientists, who seem to me most clearly to relate to some of the spiritual ideas that we are aware of and interested in, quantum scientists are in denial of the metaphysical implications of what their physics tell them and tell us about the world. And nanotechnology, too, in my humble opinion, is completely misunderstood in its revolutionary aspect, which is not that it can build upwards to robots that we can put in the bloodstream, but that it's a doorway that has been opened up, the last doorway to that completely other world of quantum reality, which is, in our Western sense, irrational and predictable. So consciousness is absolutely the primary field of inquiry for artists and for scientists. And I think we have to find a way of coming together with no one creating the meta-language to ascertain what we're developing. We've got to come together to see what we can do about this interest. And I believe that the sort of reality, which is the fifth point I wanted to make about our culture, that we have is a very mixed reality. I don't mean just that in the sense of virtual reality being mixed up with everyday perception and so on and so forth. But I think we are living on very many levels at the same time. And I think there is a solution to it, which could be found in syncretism. If we look historically, we'll see those moments when there have been great deals of conflict between cultures, between religions, between knowledge bases and so forth. A syncretic way has emerged. That's to say, where all the differences come together, they're maintained, however. They're not homogenized into one whole. The word, of course, came from the ancient Cretans, syncretism, who were warring all amongst themselves until an external enemy attacked them. And then they got it together, they maintained their differences, but they were able to repulse the enemy. We have to do that. I think scientists and artists and spiritual leaders have to come together. And the enemy that we have to confront is habit. Habitual perceptions, habitual thoughts, habitual ways of doing things that have to be challenged and thought about. And we can't do this, any one of us alone, as artists or as scientists. So I think there's another five on my mind that we could think about. One is connectivity, how important that is and how we have to, in the training of young people and so forth in their education, we have to talk about this complicated, but really in the end, simple sense of connectivity of minds, of machines, and of communities on that planetary level. We have to understand, we have to help others to come to an understanding of what it is to be immersed in hybrid space. That is, where there's no one clear distinction about what the nature of the world is, but we have to always understand how important subjectivity is in looking at these things. And we interact now across a great many modalities, and I think that's one of the strategies we have to adopt. We have to introduce the way in which we can move across modes of knowledge fluently. And then, of course, we've got to be prepared with new institutions for the emergence of new personal and cultural and spiritual and social structures which will come out of these kinds of issues that we have to try to solve. So I think a syncretic process could hold together the current ferment of ideas and images and models of reality that communities and cultures across the planet are generating. At the moment, the only solution seems to be the gun, and of course it fails absolutely every time. I think that this cultural habit has to be examined very closely. I think we have to provide the tools, particularly for young people, to analyze the habits that they fall into. We also easily do that. I think we also need to think of the what I would call a syncretic schedule in education and in professional life, where artistic and computational and psychic and pharmacological and biophysical and nanotechnological projects can be developed that could bring about new conditions for life and for art, because that's supposed to be my topic. And so I think, as I say, the scrutiny of the nano field may lead us to an understanding of ideas about the immaterial connectedness, which is espoused both by quantum physics and Eastern metaphysics. I think that immaterial connectedness is something we have to look more carefully at. And finally, in trying to identify new knowledge fields and to develop a transdisciplinary discourse and practice, I think we have to prioritize the following things. We have to prioritize subject before object, process before system, behavior before form, intuition before reason, and mind before matter. And I think if you think about it, it's absolutely the reverse, which is often presented to young people when they are coming into the world and where we're trying to provide a framework for their development. So, well, I, for my part, have a research group with nodes around the world where we're looking at these issues. And our approach really is to take a number of points and think them through. Instead of dividing things up into those behaviors of art, design, architecture, and so on and so forth, we'd like to think about the following things. First of all, how do we amplify thought? And so what is conceptual development? How can that be entertained? Never mind the details of different practices. New practices need to arise from asking these questions. How do we share consciousness? Is consciousness a field to which we are aspiring in our organism to access? Or is in fact mind simply an epiphenomenon of the brain? Are very much in favor of the idea that we would proceed at least from the idea that consciousness is a field. And so collaborative processes are very, very important then. And I think we have to think about seeding structures rather than imitating them or representing them or playing around and adapting them. We have to think about seeding structures. And I mean that on the material plane as well as the conceptual plane, that we actually think about seeding architectures that can grow, buildings that can grow as the environment changes in many senses of the environment. And so we need to talk about self-organizing systems and how they can be set up. And then we have to think, particularly as artists, but I think scientists as well, of course, about making metaphors, how important it is to challenge, as the American philosopher Richard Rorty has always said, you have to challenge the metaphors, because sometimes if they hang around too long, they become truths, and that's very dangerous. So making metaphors and knowledge navigation is another sort of part of this map that I think we should try to undertake. And finally, there's the question of self-creation. Of constructing identities, which is perhaps foremost in our culture now, but is taken on a very trivial level, sort of cosmetics and things like this. But actually thinking through the consequences of the tools we have at our disposal, genetic, biological, and so on and so forth, as well as the spiritual disciplines which are available to us, but which we regularly ignore. If we can bring these things together, we may be able to rethink what it is to be a human being, and with that take on a new kind of responsibility for how we proceed in life. So I hope I've answered your questions. I certainly ran them in together. So.
Thank you, Roy. Our next speaker is T. Siggy Hale, who is a co-founder of the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center and a postdoctoral fellow in neuroscience here at the Neuropsychiatric Institute. His research explores the implications of human beings possessing two distinct and specialized brain hemispheres. In particular, he studies how atypical cerebral asymmetry contributes to diversity of intelligence styles among human beings, as well as psychopathology. Outside of science, he has been a lifelong practitioner of martial arts and various mindfulness practices. He currently operates a sport training program that teaches mindfulness and physical intelligence to young athletes with aspirations to become professional soccer players. In the near future, he hopes to participate in the development of a movement-based mindfulness curriculum that can be evaluated as a potential component of an intervention treatment for ADHD and other disorders. This is what is on Siggy's site that describes what the aim of Mark is, to investigate to what extent the classic brain-body dichotomy in Western biological sciences can and or should be expanded to also include mind and mindful awareness, and to determine whether these constructs can lead to testable alternative treatments for psychological and psychiatric disorders. As an example of the kind of events that Mark and Siggy brings into the Mindful Awareness Research Center, on April 24th, he is hosting Dr. Sheng-Jing Ma, who is a professor and director of Integrated Medicine Research Laboratory at the UCLA School of Medicine. The two questions I wanted to ask, do you want me to ask one at a time, or you can throw them both up? The first one is, how do you negotiate this uneasy terrain of mixing what some call religious practice with scientific research? And the other one is about a recent study we read in the press and watched on the news, that the most scientifically rigorous investigation of whether prayer can heal illness, that began almost a decade ago and involved more than 1,800 patients, concluded that prayer does not work. Can you comment on this? Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to keep this brief. I'm going to keep this brief because I'm a big fan of the interactive sort of question and answer and discussion part of these things. But I think I'd like to just sort of set up the context for answering these questions to begin with. And that is that as someone who's been in the trenches of brain science for doing research actively for about 10 years now, I can tell you that at least specifically within the realm of neuroscientists, and I think physicists are on board with this also, is that we've been incredibly humbled by the difficulty of applying the traditional Western scientific methodology to studying the sort of inner realm of experience, if you want to call it that. Western science has undeniably been incredibly successful in studying the external sort of aspect of our experience, the sort of physical stuff of the world, things that are easily defined and easily measured. But when it comes to studying things like our well-being, our happiness, our lack thereof, it's incredibly difficult to apply the standard scientific methodology. To begin with, you have to be able to define like what you think happiness is before you can design an experiment to study it. So at the beginning part of this question, actually it was taken out, I thought it was interesting, was that there were 1,000 people at the last Society for Neuroscience conference who signed a petition objecting to the Dalai Lama doing a talk on the science of meditation. And what I thought was interesting about it is it was actually 1,000 of probably about 30,000 people that were attending that meeting. So I think in general, the Western scientific culture is starting to really have an appreciation for the fact that when it comes to studying internal experience, we have a lot to learn. We have a long way to go in terms of how we approach the endeavor itself. And so the thing that strikes me in the midst of all of this is that there are very, very many clear indicators that what we think and what we're doing does change the way our brain operates. Not only does it change it functionally, but there's a growing amount of research that shows that it also changes it structurally. So given that premise, it becomes very important that we start investigating how we can better regulate our internal processes. The implications are very far-reaching. That we used to think that when the brain was, when we went through our formative developmental time where the brain was growing and then it stopped and then that was it. You had what you had. But we know that's not the case anymore. The brain is very dynamic and it's changing all the time. So, this question about how do we deal with the idea that we're now studying religious things that might be conceived as being religious? Well, I don't think that as scientists we think of it that way at all. We think that we're studying the process of learning to have better regulation over our internal experience, to become more aware of our internal experience and how we can use that to change us potentially physically as well as with regards to our well-being. And the other thing is that I think in general this idea that there's this huge division between science and religion. I'm a big sort of fan of the idea that a human being is a human being is a human being. And essentially you have, everybody, I conceive of everybody as essentially being a scientist. I mean, all you have to do is watch a child and they immediately start exploring their environment and trying to do experiments to figure out what's going on. They also try to explore their inner world. And the way I see it essentially is that the contemplative practices have been engaged for a very long time in trying to investigate inner experience. The Western science has been focused on the idea of investigating external experience. However, those roads are now crossing, or they have begun to cross for some time now. And what's interesting is that within the aspects of Western science that have delved into this, although they like to be very much in sort of have this sort of scientific rigor and this great deal of sort of control over experimental process, there is admittedly an uncomfortable amount of assumption and inference that has to go on to do this. Like I was saying, you have to define even the notion of happiness before you can study it. You have to define the notion of attention before you can study it. And all these things are subjective, very subjective. So this comes into play specifically in the second part of this with this experiment that this person did on prayer. The Western scientific approach is to operationally define something. So they're going to say, this is what prayer is, and now we're going to design an experiment to test it. They test it, and by their experimental design and by their outcome measures, they found a particular result. But because of the power of language, they then have the capacity to say, well, now we say that prayer doesn't work. But this is totally contingent upon how they define prayer, how they're measuring prayer. And it's really, their results speak only to that particular circumstance that they designed, that they manipulated, and that they then measured. The idea of prayer is something that we're very far from, at least in Western culture, having some clear, generally agreed upon notion of what it actually is. So this kind of thing is rampant in this moment where science is now studying internal experience. We have to be very careful to not, as he pointed out, I mean, it's very true that there's very much a danger of scientists being able to say, oh, because of science we say this is true, and it is so. But especially, again, when you're going into this realm of studying internal experience, there's a lot of subjective interpretation. There's a lot of subjective, how we're defining these things. And it's sort of highlighted by the two elements of Western science that have spent probably the most time thus far sort of trying to explore these things would be psychology and psychiatry. And their best efforts thus far have led to this sort of, their general answer is, okay, well, psychology, if you want to make someone feel better, you talk to them. Well, that's pretty natural human behavior. It's something that it seems to work, but like as far as trying to decide and define exactly how that works scientifically, what's the mechanism, so on and so forth, I mean, it's still very much, that's what they've come up with, talk to somebody. With regard to psychiatry, it's, well, we've seen that these brain chemicals are sort of, seem to be associated with certain states, and with people who are unhappy, they seem to be in unusual sort of configurations, so we'll try to manipulate that, we'll change them. But the truth is we don't have any big picture understanding of like the basic operating system of how the brain works on almost every level. We don't know how, as he pointed out, the mind arrives from the interaction of all these different chemicals and neurons and all these different things. So the point being is that science at this point has to involve a lot of introspection, a lot of sort of using the unique, perhaps uniquely human capacity to sort of observe our own internal processes, as has been done in some of these contemplative practices for a very long time, in order to just even begin to engage in a Western sort of a scientific investigation of these things. So I see that it's absolutely clear that this merger of art and also the contemplative, what I think of as contemplative sciences, as distinguished from the kinds of control-oriented or domination-oriented types of belief systems that try to tell people, like, this is what you should think. There are contemplative sciences that have been using, as he used the word, analyze, like several times. They're using that natural human instinct for experimentation to analyze, and they're doing experiments and repeating them and sharing and pooling the data and the information and trying to get a better sense of these things within the internal experience. And these two aspects of human experience are necessarily, I think, must be combined in order to move forward into the sort of next generation of exploration, of bridging the gap between the external and the internal experience. So.
Next we have Dr. Barbara Fields, who's the executive director of the Association for Global New Thought. She is a co-founder and project director for the past 10 years of the Gandhi King Season for Nonviolence, program director of the 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, co-founder and project director of the Synthesis Dialogues with His Holiness the Dalai Lama of Tibet in Dharamsala, India in 1999, and Trent, Italy 2001, Rome 2004. She's a co-director with Dr. William Ury of Harvard Global Negotiation Project's Abraham Walk Initiative in the Middle East, conference and program director for the Society of Buddhist Christian Studies in 1996 and 2000, director of International Buddhist Christian Theosophical Encounter at the Purdue University and Lilly Foundation. She's a participant of the UNESCO Seminar on Religion and Peace in Granada in Spain, honorary doctor of Humane Letters, United Church of Religious Science in 2005, and Religious Science International First Peace Award in 2003. She is the recipient of the Peace Museum's 1998 Community Peacemaker Award in the area of diplomacy. Barbara serves on the boards of Earth Action, the Foundation for Conscious Evolution, and La Casa de Maria in Santa Barbara. She is the co-founder of the Earth Network, a nonprofit alternative television organization dedicated to the environment, social action, and human spirit, for which she received the 1994 Visionary Award from the Center for New Television. The questions I have for Barbara is for the nonviolence actions that she has been doing for the last 10 years. The actions are for 64 days. So why 64 days? What is the significance of this number? And what are some specific results that this effort came up with? And the second question is how you approach the local, global, natural, or man-made disasters in the dialogues you organize. Please welcome Barbara Fields.
I empathize with Victoria because I often form meetings like this, and this is the time when you should take some deep breaths and move a little, and you'll feel much better if you do, an hour and a half in. When I saw the first question, I had to laugh a little because the Season for Nonviolence, the Gandhi King Season for Nonviolence, is a project that commemorates the 50th and 30th, respectively, memorial anniversaries of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Gandhi anniversary falls on January 30th, and in 1998 it was the 50th anniversary, as was Dr. King's 30th anniversary. And Victoria, I have to tell you that the 64 days is simply the period of counting days between one and the other anniversaries. There's no mystical significance to the number, or is there? The project came about, I think it's useful to say, Dr. Arun Gandhi, who is the grandson, and Mrs. Ela Gandhi, who is the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi, were looking for a way to celebrate and memorialize their grandfather for his contribution in the field of peacemaking and compassion. And when they asked this, we soon discovered it was also the same anniversary for Dr. King, and we were thinking of a way to commemorate, not just by having another meeting or another conference, but something that would be meaningful to people. And so the question that I've been asking myself, since this is now entering its 10th year next year, we launch this project every year at the United Nations. It has now taken root in over 400 cities in 18 countries and created ongoing community projects that have lasted and created healing in these many communities. The question that I've been asking myself since I was surprised by this invitation is, what does this have to do with this particular discussion we're having today? And what occurs to me, and I don't often have a chance to talk about this with audiences or groups, is that the understory of this program and many of the social action programs that I'm involved in reveals in a way that we are all trying to discover, to reveal, and to evolve the field. And by field, I'm not speaking metaphorically or rhetorically. I'm saying that we're actually all trying to point toward what is the ground of all being that transcends all of the disciplinary attitudes that we represent here. And it's very, very gratifying to me that we could have a discussion like this, and I've been involved in many of this kind because it's only by encountering another worldview outside of our specialized area that we begin to see the common truths that transcend and undergird all of the truths that we're finding in our particular work, and why all of these very juicy questions are coming up now. We can easily see that confined to our own disciplines, they're almost impossible to get beyond a certain ceiling. But the minute that we begin to encounter the truths of the other and the processes of the other, we begin to establish and maybe even embody this collective intelligence pool that we have to tap into. It's interesting because, as Roy pointed out, we talked about the enemy being the enemy of the habit of our thinking. And I realize that no matter how we try to get around it, there's a kind of a chronology or a linearity in the way that we look at the way that society itself evolves. Well, there's a word I like very much, the word meme, which basically describes the way that a new worldview or a new behavior becomes codified in a society where we actually begin to understand ways of being in that society that seem self-evident. We almost take them as reality itself. But in fact, they're just ways of looking at a particular set of circumstances set in time. I think that these experiments, such as the Season for Nonviolence, are creating, in a nonlinear way, a demonstration of a new way of social organizing that may precede the science in a certain way. What more do I want to say about this question? I wanted to read you just a sentence from the mission. New Thought, which is the organization that I represent, is a spiritually motivated way of life that embraces the ancient wisdom traditions of East and West. We embody the belief that consciousness is elementally creative, reciprocates thought, and thereby shapes all manifestation. This experiment comes from what we call spiritually motivated social activism, and it is people who are changing the world by changing the way that they look at organizing themselves. They use technologies, and we call them technologies like prayer. Sorry, I'm kind of dry. Prayer and intentionality, and the ability to be fully present and not be attached to outcomes. Thank you. In other words, they're trying to embody what is the new consciousness by becoming a vehicle to express what is in the field beneath the action. So I think that this has very much to do with all of this discussion and how it's acting itself out at a social level. The synthesis dialogues that we saw a picture of before with the Dalai Lama was actually an attempt to do the same thing at a leadership level that we did at a grassroots level with the Season for Nonviolence. And that was to bring world leaders from many disciplines together, from the fields of government and education and science and the arts and media, and basically ask whether they could, from this meta-mind or collective view, think of better ways of problem solving. So basically it's all about an attempt to do this, to break the bounds that we're in our academic societies and in our institutions. So.
So the last speaker is James Jimjewski, who I've been collaborating with. And this picture, what you see here, is one of the monks from the Garden Shatsa monastery who came to Jim's lab and worked with him on the microscope to go into the grain of sand using the scanning electron microscope. This other shot is Losang and another monk looking at the scanning tunneling microscope, and I liked the comment they made when they said, "You need all this to create emptiness," and kind of looked sadly at him, like, oh. So a bit of an introduction. Sorry. This is an image from a show we did together, and this is something that just a snapshot of Jim's mind, his calculations on the grain of sand. He was trying to explain to me how many billions of atoms are in this grain of sand. I don't quite remember, but I thought it was wonderful. And our discussions many times enter into this realm where he talks about the molecular level and the level of looking at electron probabilities and waves and empty space, which of course we have come up with, and this has been one of the most recent researches that he's been involved with, where he actually, with his research team, started listening to cells, and by amplifying the vibrations of the cells and actually detecting the difference between live and dead cells, which has inspired people from all walks of life, to tell you the truth. So the two questions I have is, because we know each other well, I can vouch that he's definitely very much inspired and influenced by Buddhist thought and philosophy, and also has truly participated in the art project. It has not been a side hobby interest. And the first question is how this has influenced, how the Buddhist thought has influenced your work, and if this is any different from the work you have been doing together with me in art. And the second question is a little tougher, but I insisted on asking it. Given that Buddhist and most spiritual practices have non-violence at the core, do you find it difficult to conduct your research in the current academic/political context?
Thank you. So recently, I have a new phenomena that occurs that every time I speak, I have a different opinion. It keeps changing, and it's influenced by the people that have spoken before. And today, earlier on, Jeff Grupp gave a talk. He's a philosopher about Buddhism and quantum theory. And in that picture, there is no time. So at this moment, there's just flash into existence, and flash into existence. Just flashes. And the atoms we know, or the atoms I know, are different from the Buddhist atoms. Very interesting. So the question is, has Buddhist philosophy influenced my scientific work? And I would say, yes. So actually there was a day about 10 years ago, and I was sitting in a room, and there was a hairdresser, hairdresser, but it wasn't in it. I was in this room for 3 days. I was locked in this room for 3 days with 4 hours sleep per day. And we had to sort of meditate, and I didn't believe in it. And he was shouting in my head, he was shouting, yeah, there's no hope for you. It's just a waste of time. There's nothing, you know. You're useless, you're hopeless, nothing can save you. And all the stuff since your birth, your thoughts and everything, it's just going to stick inside you. You're going to go nowhere. You're doomed, to this unhappiness and so on. And something happened at this moment. And basically, I was no longer in the room. I was nowhere, and I didn't exist. And I didn't exist at all. And I didn't actually, the universe was there. Somehow the universe was there, but I was there, but I was the universe. And it was a really strange moment. It was very strange. And it was, it changed my life. And it introduced me to meditate, to do like some Zen Buddhism. I very much like the Sikh, the Kundalini yoga meditation, and also to meet the Tibetan monks and to be lucky enough to talk to them about science. And it changed my perspective in science very much. So there's another day. I'll give you another day. There was another day. For many years, for 30 years, I worked to try to look at atoms. And I couldn't look at them, but I could feel them with a very small finger in my work. And I touched the atom, and then, you know, I could move the atom, and I could look at the atom. And this was my dream for 30 years. And when I got there, it was horrible. It was boring. It was an atom. It was an atom. It's boring. Wasted time. I'd wasted my life for 30 years. But it took 30 years. So these two moments are important moments. And I don't even believe it's an atom. No, I don't believe it's an atom. In some ways. So how is it? So if we think of today, maybe, and I don't want to speak for science but just me. I'll speak for me, because it's not because I'm an egotist, but maybe it's just to be honest. Everything is converging, and you know, it's marvelous to hear. You see, the Dalai Lama writes about, here, the Dalai Lama is writing about quantum mechanics. He talks about Rutherford, and I don't know if he writes that as a joke, maybe I don't know if it's really serious. Is he really serious? Maybe, does he really, because I think this, you know, I remember Losan. So Losan came to the lab once, and I showed him that equipment, and I said, you know, the atoms. At that time I was interested in the atoms. I thought it was something very interesting, and it sort of is, but and he said for a meditation they count atoms. You count atoms on the wall. And I thought, crazy. Today I'm not so sure, because maybe they're not really anyway atoms. And I become interested in things like, you know, quarks and string theories, and so these theories, like Jeff today, you know, I think if you have the chance to listen to his talk, it is streamed. I mean, Jeff is just one person, and I independently found this type of approach, that the Indian philosophy is so similar to somehow the scientific one, but not the scientific one we know every day, but the more speculative one, that there is hope for science. There's something interesting to interest the scientist where there was nothing. You know, an atom. An atom is an atom. So, and I don't know if there's a difference between Buddhistic philosophy and science, and so some people say that Buddhistic philosophy is a science. It's not a philosophy. And maybe science is a philosophy. And my degree is in natural philosophy. And being a natural, if my degree is in natural philosophy, then Buddhism is seems like the best philosophy in terms of its, for me. So given the second part, the second part relates to this. As a scientist, I do research projects that involve being funded by government organizations. Government organizations like DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Planning Association. I have projects that are funded by NASA. I have projects funded by Colgate-Palmolive on teeth. I have projects funded by the National Institute of Health. So you might think that, yeah, morally, you know, this DARPA project is terrible. This is what scientists would some scientists believe, and that the Colgate Palmolive project is very good because you have nice shiny teeth. And does this relate to violence? You know, so in doing these projects, I'm very interested in things that inspire me. I'm not interested in making things that destroy people. And so for each project I do, one has to look at, I have to look internally at myself and believe, is that good or bad? Is it really good or bad? And I do that, and I'm open to talk to artists or people who would like to know what these projects are about. They're not secret. So I do not have a problem with this. However, I would like everybody else to have a problem with it. Because science is often demonized. You know, we make bombs, we do bad things. In fact, if you actually look at history and you look at people that started wars, and in reverence to, you know, we find there have often been religious people that start the war. Buddhism is not so much the case, but usually religious people. The other people who started wars are also artists, like Hitler started a war as a painter. Scientists are hardly ever actually at the point of starting a war, although the technology they create is used for wars. So the first person that invented a knife, it could be used for killing, it could be used for food, for slaying animals, but it can also be used for surgery. So it has many positive and negative sides. And I think it's impossible to be a scientist and be creative without having this possibility that what you create will be misused. It's impossible to be an artist. And let us face it, propaganda in times of war is a very powerful tool, and is generated by artists and by people that generate literature. So there's always a group of scientists and people from every walk of life that participate in, directly or indirectly, in violence. And I myself believe in peace, and I try to do my science along those lines.
Well, I think we got a large spectrum to respond to, so if everybody could take a seat here, we would like to engage the audience. Take your questions, or if you have something to say, to add to this discussion. This way. It's okay. You can go ahead. And I would just ask everyone to please use the mic, because we are streaming, and if you, no matter how loud you speak on the stream, we won't hear you. So, I will play Oprah and pass the mic around and see if anybody wants to start saying something. And if I detect 10 seconds of silence, I'll pass it back on to these guys to respond quickly. Any questions?
I have two questions. One, do you have a Christian representative that you think would be positive or make a contribution to the subject matter? And number two is that there will be next week the centennial for the Azusa Street Revival in LA. And from 1906 till today, there's something like 600 million Pentecostals in the world. And I know Pentecostals believe in prayer, they have miraculous stories about prayer and science. So I'm wondering, can you capitalize on the knowledge of the Pentecostal and translate that into science?
Are you asking Jimzewski? Who are you directing the question to? Anyone?
Anyone.
Anyone. Who wants to take that on? Barbara.
Thank you. You know, even though more of my expertise is in the interfaith world, my work is with a network of about 800 very progressive Christian-based churches. And for them, for us, for me, there is a way of saying that God is everything. But it's all a question of language. And some people can't hear that language, so they use another language in order to be dealing with the very same deep issues of faith and truth and love and compassion. And I do know that the Christian population in the world is most focused on the Gospels, that with everything put aside, that the teachings of their exemplar, their Messiah, Jesus, are everything. And once again, we're here encountering a variety of worldviews, from science to medicine to healing to religion to social action. And we have to remember that in order to really reach people, it really matters what language you're using, and if it's a foreign language that they can't understand, or whether it's a familiar language that many Christians do understand. Otherwise, there's no crosstalk. So I totally understand the contribution of Christianity and the teachings of Jesus and the gospel, and I totally understand the benefit of prayer, and I base my life on it in many ways. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's an attempt.
Go ahead. Good. Anybody else? Whoever's holding, does anybody else? Oh, I see. Roy, did you want to say something?
Well, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but I just sort of would like to emphasize what happens in Brazil, a country I visit very frequently, and I see as holding in its current evolution the future in many ways. And there, I was talking briefly earlier about syncretism, and of course it's absolutely embodied there in the spiritual practices of that country, where Western African candomblé, Christian Catholicism, French Spiritism, and the wisdom from people who live in the forest come together in practices like Umbanda and so forth, which flowers in art forms, in dance, in music, in spiritual practices, as I say, in this syncretic way. And I think that's, for me, where questions of, and the problems that seem to exist between organized religion and spiritual practice, and I see in our Western world huge problems in that respect, where they're almost mutually exclusive in many ways, with great respect to both sides, so to speak. That in Brazil, there seem to be these cultural and spiritual movements which hold some promise for the future. A promise which is not evident in another part of the world, like the Middle East at the moment, where there is this horrendous conflict of religious organizations. So I just wanted to sort of bring that into the discussion, basically.
I'd like to ask the panel what they think about artists bringing together science, religion, fiction to change world's view on how they relate to God and view God in like an entertainment form, and what you would think is kind of required of those artists to do that.
Jim and Roy should answer this.
So if I understand the question, it was art, science, religion coming together, and what were they doing?
Artists that basically try to combine religion, what they know of religion, what they know of science, to put out something, say a book or a movie, to let people take a different view as how they would relate to God and relate with God. What do you feel about that?
Well, I personally, you see, as far as I know, the word God didn't appear until you mentioned God, and you mentioned God. I have a problem with the word God, you see. I mean, I was brought up as a devout Protestant. I used to teach at school the Protestant religion. Then I became a Roman Catholic when I was a teen, right? And then I became an existentialist. Now, Buddhism is a good way. So I would say that if you were to bring awareness, some higher sense of awareness, ephemeral awareness, mindful awareness, the awareness that we talked about, that would be a very positive thing. Unfortunately, when just that specific word God is used, it's not really, it's not that I don't believe in it or whatever, but it has too many connotations that I think people should, rather than focus maybe on the concept of the God, they should focus on, they should be unfocused, more unfocused. They're too focused. So you get arts and science and religion and they all focus on God. No. Why don't you actually unfocus? Totally just focus out. No focus. And art, science and religion can help to completely unfocus us. Totally. So that we don't have the eye problem so much. Maybe.
Remege tene anzo chulo chola ya tene kete pingu da tena debege tene neju ganga tene remega ne tini ta mo debege ne de chungo re a sambege dijeje tene remole ya tene di neju ke suzu gyule shebe jeje tene pena par ya poji yoba ina par ya poji tena sembala kate tewa tingdo o nyama de chungo da de chungo da sene 이게 이제 메타네 수술이야 편도티 연구です. 배나 수술이야 라고 삽자지 여비나. 점성에 삽자지 여비나. 중间난 조금나 가지게 편도도 왔어. 수술이야. 로바 근데 제도 왔어. 아 근데 그 편도야. 아니 메타네 되겠어.
Like first of all, that how the art is very, very useful in our spiritual practice or in our daily life, in a fiction or non-fiction life. Usually first the art, difference between the Western and the Asian art is the Western art express about the physical expressions or expressions of one's own eye. But the true spiritual art express about the ultimate view of your realizations. And also creating, like, by learning more about the art is to help us that those great beings with their own meditational practice, that they have certain kind of realizations or visions. It's expressions of their realizations. So that is like when we look at the art, it is to inspire us to be the same person as that great beings. So that's how that it expresses about and how it is useful to apply. And then even, for example, even in our temporary like a level, how the art is useful is, if it is a beautiful object, art, even one person is very depressed, by looking at the beautiness of that art, it will give us an inner happiness of feelings that will give us some joy by looking at the beautiful art. And along with that, like for example, like a map quest. So without having a map quest, it may be difficult to visit around the town. But if you have a piece of art, that's the map is a piece of art. With this, it will be easy to reach there without any difficulty. So that's how that the art, for example, about art, is how it is useful in our spiritual point of view, in our general point of view. So this is very, very useful, the art is.
Tene share tena share je tanga ina, tene che yak mo tanga je, mi simde la tanga ina, tene share tanga che da simde ge de kanga ba la je. Tene share ge che na le ge che nyambo de je ka je, de tanda su su de shemba je, tene chogo ta a samsa ge che de simle yile ten, amjole ya tene nyambo ten, che de ammo de yile ten de ge tene share ge tene chole ya tene lul dawa je go le. tene shöpinga de pato chicken dawa je kanga chicken dawa je ma do chigi shöte de chi khana ji yo ma de no ju je kanga chu ru je ne andu tubul kanga le ya de la kwa kanga yue no chu ru je ne mi la ga chi tu go le na shi gi kanga ji phan do je chu ru de de de.
And like a art, like a song, if it is a beautiful sound, beautiful meaning, then a person is really depressed or something, had a difficulty, even by listening that beautiful sound of the music and followed by the beautiful meaning on it, it will give a very release through their sound, and also the meaning is so beautiful, profound, that it will give inner happiness. So that's how that even the art, like a song and music, can give us an inner relief. So that's why art is such a way that it has to come, art, science and religion has to come together, because one should not think that I don't need science and art, that I will just follow spiritual or religion. That is absolutely wrong path, a wrong way to think. Because for example, to consider me without having my leg or feet or head, I cannot call this is me. It needs every part. So similarly, to apply, to consider oneself as a true religious or spiritual practitioner, it needs the combinations of those, the art, science and religion. So only then that person can be a complete spiritual or the religious practitioner.
Roy,
just my point. Well, I think, in all these questions, the meeting place is consciousness. The one thing we know nothing about seems to be an ideal meeting place for art and science and spiritual practices to come together. But I think we've got to be brave. The scientists try to explain consciousness, and they've been a total failure at that. I don't blame them, they tried hard enough, but they have absolutely no idea. The artist, on the other hand, navigates it. But I think we have to be brave in that. I think we have to look at pharmacology, for example. All the ancient cultures that address the question of the spiritual and of consciousness used, in their case, plants, in our case, chemistry, to change mind states, to try to enter these other realms of consciousness. We haven't talked much about that today, but it seems to me that there are probably different qualities and perhaps spheres, perhaps worlds of consciousness to be investigated. And it's notable that in the West, religion has been the most oppressive force to prevent that. And politics, of course, backs it up. And you've got to ask yourself why. Why are we policed in the exploration of our own minds? Well, we know why. Because it would liberate us, because it would allow us to be creative, it would allow us to be more spiritual. And that's exactly what state interests are set against. So we have to be brave. We have to take on board the possibility of investigating worlds that it could be in some ways dangerous, but certainly unknown and uncertain territory for us to discover. But certainly I think consciousness is the field that could bring, the study of it is the field that could bring us all together in certain ways.
Can I make one comment? I think it's very interesting that we are sort of trying to get this sense of how spiritual traditions and religion and science can sort of interface. And in both cases, there is this sort of process of insight, which then can be expressed as art, and then eventually can sort of be transmutated into some explicit sort of knowledge, where someone puts it into language and tries to describe it, and then do experiments around it in the case of science, or perhaps develop philosophies around it, or even religious dogmas. But I think it's noteworthy that it is, like, both sides of this puzzle to me are very important. Like, it's very important that we learn to, as he's describing, delve deeper into this process of exploration that leads to insight, and to honor the idea that we can, through observing our own experiences and delving deeper into them and having a very open mind, that we can come to discover information. In fact, Einstein and all of the great scientists talk about this sort of playing with ideas, and it's not sort of rigorous analytical thought that leads to these vast sort of leaps forward in science. It's insight. It's sort of a form of revelation that then you go through and you try to knock out all the different pieces and hone it down and create something that we can see in the physical world. But that's where I think science and religion share this commonality. The other commonality is that they're both, not so much perhaps that when I say religion, I guess I'm talking specifically about the sort of continued exploration of spirituality, the continued exploration of inner experience. It's sort of this idea that we're continually trying to hone and further develop and expand our ideas of both external and internal realities. Very different than the dogma that's associated with, strictly held belief systems. And that happens to a large extent in science also, in different areas in history more than others, but it's definitely a part of the scientific process that people get caught in saying, well, we now have the answer, and then it stops. And I think whether you're doing internal or external, that's really, as he's saying, it's a big enemy to the process of continuing to hone and further expand our concepts of realities.
I have two questions. The first one is directed at Dr. Hale. What sort of study designs do you recommend that will allow for more of this organic outcomes, and that might produce more internally scientific, realm that you're talking about? And then my second question is to the Lama Rinpoche is, how do you see or define self-esteem if we're really nothing?
First question to me?
Yeah.
And the question was, how would one devise a curriculum to foster a sort of balance between these?
Well, yeah, because traditionally science is really trying to apply rigor with defining the outcomes before we really we start the research, right? And so it doesn't, besides qualitative research or maybe the more new research around community-based, participatory research, but in the strictly scientific realm, and you're kind of merging the two, are you applying a different sort of design that will allow for a more organic outcome rather than this, trying to hone down the outcomes before you start? So you could possibly use art as a measurement or art as an outcome.
Well, I think it sort of run itself into its own dead end in a way, in terms of the sort of strict, rigorous process. Like the reductionists kept reducing until they got to this sort of expansive mystery in quantum mechanics and whatnot. And so in that way, it's sort of revising it. It's necessarily revising itself. It's taking a while for people to get the implications of these things, but it's happening. And I think that, for instance, like as neuroscience struggles with trying to empirically study all of these these concepts that are very subjective, these kinds of things are coming to bear. For instance, like in the study of attention, we have a notion that attention is this certain thing where you're like focused on like something at the expense of all these other things or whatever. But it's like maybe distraction is another really important state of attention that is very important for discovery, for insight, and these other kinds of things. So it's sort of like I think we're always running into our own dead end and then being forced to evolve. So I feel that there are people, especially in this realm of brain imaging, places where we're trying to create like actual measurements of some of these activities that we think are associated with these internal processes and stuff, where there is a sort of degree of understanding that there's a lot of subjectivity in this. So the sort of criteria by which people are assessing it is slightly different than if it was in a more straightforward, sort of mechanical kind of study. So I think it's sort of happening.
Good to know. Could you answer my second question?
That means how do you define?
How do you define self-esteem for really nothing?
Really nothing, you mean?
This concept of nothingness and empty space.
Danda dancing a day, but that day I watch it and do Mavis or jig. I'm going to have to on the some logic on the come Mavis or jig. Some logic on the dancing at the payment of Suzuki Louis, you don't die it and went to the check the knee check this. Some lay a budget on the alien.
Usually, first of all, that like we have to know what is nothingness. I think that would be the wrong interpretations for emptiness. It can be considered as the nihilism also, falling into nothingness. So this could happen like we consider this as me, like I, and with our own wisdom or consciousness, when we analyze, differentiating all the parts apart, and the moment will come that we cannot point out that this is called me, and that is the point you call nothingness. So, and that may like to bring like, oh, as if that there's nothing, I doesn't exist of its own. And at the same time, like when we have a strong grasping to a self, me, then as if that every part about this part is called like an I, like the I exists of its own without depending on any causes and condition that I exist. So that is called the eternalism. I think eternalism, that means you hold a view as it exists of its own without depending on causes condition. So these are the two things that one has to know in details. So it's like for example, that how we perceive, like if there's the art in the pictures. So without thinking twice, all of a sudden we have some kind of feelings that, oh, there's an art. That's like letters. For example, once an image, if it shine in the screen, if you don't analyze at once, if you see, one may like you to say, oh, that's me. So that is like without analyzing. But if you analyze carefully, that's just a reflection in the screen. That's not you. So similarly, that I is something that when we don't analyze, and all of a sudden, if you look at once, we call this is me. That means just holding me. And with your second thought, with the philosophical thought, if you analyze carefully, then it will begin to understand that I or me doesn't exist of its own. It is the fabrications of all the parts. So that's how that, in order to know that, one has to need a lot of training about it. Training about how to analyze and how to differentiate those, because it doesn't mean that like an emptiness or nothingness that you are saying doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does exist, but it exists because of the depending on many factors, causes and conditions. That's why it is called emptiness, because anything that doesn't exist of its own is called emptiness. Anything that exists of its own without depending on causes and conditions, that means that is not emptiness. So that's how that it has to analyze carefully. And in this, that's why in the Buddhist philosophy, like anything that you analyze, you see everything around. But when you analyze with your true wisdom, it doesn't exist of its own. It has to depend on many causes and conditions, then it will be created. That is called emptiness. I hope you understand. So this is how that we perceive in a different way. For example, an object that all of a sudden we may think this is mine or this is it. And once you because without analyzing, and when we hold this object, then we try to crave on it because we believe that it exists of its own. But once you analyze carefully with your proper wisdom, and you begin to understand it is the fractals of many parts, and it doesn't exist of its own, then immediately your consciousness will understand, and it will make you less grasping towards that, because you know the reality of that object that doesn't exist of its own. Because there's something that, anything that when we desire, that we try to grab, we have a misconception that we grab because we think that exists of its own, and that gives us happiness or peace, or that's why we desire to achieve, that if we achieve, we will be happy. But the moment we begin to understand that that object doesn't exist of its own, then the desire will be less, because you know that it doesn't exist of its own. So therefore, like in Buddhist philosophy, is like anything that like how we perceive, it depends how you think from within inside. It's not like the happiness or suffering doesn't come from the external object. No. How? Because even you think carefully, it will know, you will begin to understand. For example, one's own best friend. When you have a best friend, a same person, even saying any word, you may like it, because your desire and attachment is so strong that whatever that person say, you may like it and you may feel the best friend. You will see all the good qualities. But from the same person, if because of small misunderstanding, immediately if there's a hatred, anger arise, that object will change immediately, and you may begin to hate that person, and you may not like even him or she may say a nice word, you may not like it, because it's not that person is creating those differences or changing. It is because you change. If it is motivated by anger and hatred, the object will change. If it is motivated by desire and attachment, the object will change. But the object is same. Morning you see that friend is same, morning and evening the same person, but how you perceive from your own consciousness, how it is motivated by, it will immediately change that, and it makes a difference. That's why a true practitioner means you have to check inside and try to balance those without falling into desire, or hatred or anger, because the one who motivated by those, it will immediately change the external view. So that's how that is must to check inside.
I've just begun reading Ray Kurzweil's book called The Singularity is Near, in which he puts forward the idea that intelligence and consciousness is subject really to exponential growth without limit, in a way. So the other growths that we're used to bump up against material limits and then to end up being S-shapes. But he's saying a paradigm shift moves one S into the next S, the replacement technology, and Moore's law is likely to go on, and computers design more and more intelligent computers, and this process continues to accelerate, and we're getting very near a point of explosion. And it's all sort of very convincing. I'm thinking of two kinds of arithmetic, one with limits and finite, and the other with infinite, which really grains of sand is about as infinite as the planet gets, and these are the ingredients of artificial intelligence, which when we merge with it then can take us to unprecedented realms. On the other hand, I've had this fascination with crystals for years and the atomic lattice, and I realized that in many ways they're an ideal home for consciousness, in the sense that they've got a coordinate system based on the order in the lattice and the symmetry there, but there's enough irregularities to embody enormous amounts of information. So actually, under our noses, in the mineral kingdom, already exist the very conditions that Ray Kurzweil is saying that we're going to arrive at. And so it's really more a matter of communication with what one might call the kingdom of heaven. Doesn't mean the original creator, but if the crystal formations on planet Earth have been here a long time ahead of us, and quite possibly can send photons that cause mutations and could conceivably be considered as our creators, then I'm interested in the panel's views of those possibilities and how they feel about the singularity coming around.
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of fact, coming over to the States a few weeks ago from Europe, I picked up Robert Temple's book, which is precisely on the use of lenses originally, and crystals and mirrors in the pre-ancient world. And he started out with the idea that he might find one or two in museums around the world, and then when he really looked into it, discovered there were many, many more than he could possibly classify. And he points to the importance of the crystal, of the lens, which so illuminates, and that is the right word, modern physics. For example, he makes the point that if you take a lens, a crystal lens, whatever lens it is, in a completely, absolutely darkened room without any light in it whatsoever, it will not only allow you to read a manuscript and enlarge it, it will actually provide the light to do so, because it has this capacity to collect the photons and so on. And for that reason, and for the ability to make fire, and for the ability to understand the structure of the universe in some metaphorical way, which is what he claims for these ancient cultures, the place of the lens and the crystal, he places very, very highly, and in a way that it seems, archaeologists and so forth have completely ignored, have been ignorant of. I mean, even museums have massive collections of these things, but don't classify them as that. And so, I mean, this is, by the way, it's to certainly amplify what you were saying. I believe there's a lot more to be discovered, and I know there's a lot going on in scientific research as well with crystal structures and so on. But I would like to pass that on my level, a sort of paperback, but very well researched, I have to say.
And the name of the author
is Robert Temple. And I forget what the title is, The Crystal Something. You can guess what it might be. But it's about these lenses and so on and so forth. And I really do recommend it for people at my level of understanding science, which is
and
relatively low.
For another point of view, maybe Jim can tell us about the fusion experiment involving crystals and the new mirroring experiment. Really phenomenal stuff.
I worked on computers for 19 kind of years. I worked in IBM.
The fusion experiment?
But the crystals, I did meet, his name's, was it Wolfgang Haeckel, I think. And he, for years, had this theory. He was trying to prove it that, certain minerals, the surface of the mineral is such that amino acid molecules that make up the DNA, and there's phosphates and things, that somehow the mineral acted as a template, you follow me, to put them down so that they would link up, and then under the action of light or so, something would happen. And it's a kind of, but it's a strange way to look at life. It's trying to find, a very materialistic beginning of life and say, well, it started like in a chemical factory, this accidental, chemical reaction started and life came from that accidental, chemistry. And I think the arguments about, artificial intelligence and so on, and can we make bigger computers that would make, intelligent systems, is a similar way to look at it, So far, the good news is that most attempts at artificial intelligence are disasters. And at the time IBM were working with artificial intelligence, and Roy's more an expert than me, but at the time of that, all the people in the artificial intelligence project started going nuts, and they had to be taken off the project.
Right,
But wait, I wanted you to relate the use of the crystal and the fusion experiment.
Yeah, so there is an experiment. We generated thermonuclear fusion using a crystal. And we published this in Nature, and we're able to generate high energy neutrons and protons. And it seems like just using basically a cup of iced water, 1 cup of iced water, to cool a crystal, and you configure it the right way, and it's like a magic crystal, sure enough. And you can generate nuclear fusion. And then people think, well, that's either crazy, which it's not, or they think it's amazing, which it's not. It's just actually interesting. It's just nobody really, people have a problem thinking. And this is where art and Buddhism and all these things help, maybe, that you would think that to do this you need a big giant machine, like the size of bigger than this room. In fact, next door, just next door here, there's a tokamak, a big, and it doesn't generate anything. But this little crystal does, and really it came about by just thinking in a unfocused, non-reductionist way. And that's how it came. But it's not. It's really weird. It's. I almost thought it. I started to question if the experiment came because I thought about the experiment. And if you think about it and have enough intent, the experiment works. That's how crazy I'm going these days.
Any last questions back there?
I had a question for Rinpoche. In Buddhism, you study one of the ways of alleviating suffering is to study the dependent nature of arising and to have first an intellectual understanding of emptiness and then a meditative understanding of emptiness ultimately. Do you think that through science or art, people who are not practicing Buddhism could come to maybe an intellectual understanding of emptiness and dependent arising?
and they show that the tanda tsenrek dan dene remoge dene lobjon chene namba chög mayamba che digi dene toni dene de totu urbe dene digi tongegi zawa de chetu urbe dene de joinsa
tonyegi tawa di tonyegi bin rodan di lobjon mache nana tonyegi tawa di shinda che lobjon di deba remoda dene lobjon chena dene tonyegi tanda di shitu kora sudo ke tonyegi tawa di rodan di kende jode tonye tombani medan de tombani ne de kende jodo de la tarje chen ti jula sudo jula sambal chato ji ku rema do ji ramala tene tonye de ma so do ya da de yo ma
about the suffering, how to overcome, actually the route to cut down the suffering by realizing the emptiness directly is the only key to cut down the root of the suffering. By using the modern, like the science and then the art, this may become the tools to help you to understand about the emptiness. But just like living the art, you know the art and you try to understand about the meaning of emptiness, that may not help you to realize, though it may bring some understanding about the emptiness. So in reality is to know and to realize the emptiness must need to understand each and every details about what emptiness means. And one may like to understand with the help of science and art, but you need a specific practice to know about the emptiness, and just knowing is not enough to help you to cut down the root of suffering, but you have to practice and you have to gain the wisdom out of wisdom realizing emptiness, through the labor of your practice. Only then it will cut down the root of suffering. So it's like how we give an example is like a art, and science will be like a bicycle. So it may be some of the way to help you to reach some of the destinations, and also it may be on the way to learn more about, but doesn't mean just by learning how to bicycle, you may know how to ride a car, how to drive a car. So that's how that it may become the key to help you to learn more, but it may not like totally help you to understand or realize.
Barbara, can you say something about the same question from a different point of view?
So you're wondering whether one can come to that same state of inner balance and contentment if they're not doing it through the practice of Buddhism or something related to that practice?
If they can get closer to it or have some idea.
In other words, a source of inspiration is equal for, is emptiness, you could call it. And when Jim arrives to that place through his science, or an artist through your art form, is that comparable, or is it somehow not because it doesn't go through the methodologies of Buddhist practice?
I think this whole discussion today has been an exploration of the fact that because of the limitations of our intellect and our experience and our practice and our history and our habits and our disciplines, that what we understand is that perhaps now we're finally getting conscious enough to understand that we're trying to go to a ground that transcends and supersedes all of those distinctions, because really those are just symbol systems and languages for understanding what is basically an unbroken reality or an unbroken field underneath. And my feeling about this is, it was said very well by a book I read a long time ago that was, it was a dialogue between J. Krishnamurti and David Bohm, and it was called The Ending of Time. And at that point they made the case that, you know, basically if you could simply look at all of the trappings of what you call your reality in the context of what they called finite and what they called infinite, that there were always a set of circumstances that were impermanent but presenting themselves as real, as Maya in the way that the Hindus would put it, but that as we're talking about in this discussion of nanoscience and quantum physics, when you really investigate, as Rinpoche said in the beginning, an understanding from the bottom up, step by step by step, you start to understand that this is all immaterial, literally immaterial anyway, and that our whole aspiration then is to understand what is the infinite container that holds within it all of these various aspects of our experience. And basically you just choose the game that suits you. That's what it comes down to sometimes.
Good, sir.
Yes. This one, like when we talk about suffering, like before we know more about the emptiness or the reality of every phenomena, like if you want, like everyone has two wish. The two wish is wanted happiness at any cost and don't want suffering. So now it's all mathematics, calculations. So we have to know that where the suffering comes from and from how that happiness will come. So if you analyze carefully, it will help us to understand that it's all because of the actions. Now actions. So the actions, each action has its own reactions. So if you do a good actions, reactions will be good. If you do a negative actions, reactions will be negative. So now the sufferings are the reactions of negative actions. So this way, once you understand it is all because of the law of cause and effect, then it will help you to understand, oh, whatever the suffering we are facing, nothing happened accidentally. There's no such thing called bad luck or good luck. You make it happen, you face it. So this obviously makes no excuse. There's no mistakes there. So therefore, once we begin to understand, then try to strike into good actions. So what are the good actions? Then we have to understand. So good action will be obviously like generating the good motivations, helping others, or creating peace in your mind, not to harm other beings. These are the positive actions. So the moment that we begin to generate those positive actions, then it obviously clears the negative parts. So though that one may face the suffering, this is something, the imprints of the action that we have already engaged that means it's ripening. But since from then onwards, when we create the more positive action, the reactions of the positive action will be all virtuous. So that's how that it generates the more energy we call the merit. The merit is the key to help us to overcome those suffering. And then, and along with that, then we begin to understand about the reality of suffering. So because how to help us to overcome the suffering is when we begin to understand that every phenomena that doesn't exist of its own, but it is the fabrications of many things, and in fact it is the contaminated. That means it is the object of desire. That means no matter what, that if you strike, if you try to achieve the contaminated phenomena, the reality of contaminated phenomena is to change its face. That means never satisfying. That means even one may think that this looks good, maybe you may work whole life to achieve that, but finally when you achieve, you may not like that because it will change. That's why it's called the suffering of change, suffering of suffering, and the progressive suffering. That's how that everything is in reality, it changes. So that's how it will begin to understand. So the more you begin to understand and you apply that, that will help you to understand about the emptiness. And then when you begin to understand and when you practice, you will achieve a wisdom called the wisdom realizing emptiness. And that wisdom is the key to encounter all the suffering, because no more, because that kills, that it's like destroy the negative imprint. So that's how that it will give us the inner peace.
I have two questions.
Okay.
One is do you believe that 19th century epistemology is translated into 21st century technology? I think technology is just catching up with 19th century.
I agree.
Second question. Shall I repeat it? My first question was that do you believe, as I do, that 19th century epistemology is now the reflection of 21st century technology? The second question is the power of abstract expressionists to capture the human spirit. It seems to be lacking in contemporary art and science projects. What do you think?
Well, can I mean, there's a certain amount of truth, I think, in the first claim, because it's very interesting that the epistemology of the 19th century was actually much more open to forces and fields that lie just beyond our perceptual range. You'll remember that it was in America that table rapping and lots of discussions about disincarnate spirits and lots of ideas that we rather look down on now in science, telepathy and so on, were going very strong until the 20th century, when the organization that came originally from the Enlightenment and through things like the Royal Institution and so forth in England really started getting very, very strong and clamping down on all this speculation. And I would agree with you that if you look at, you can make a kind of correlation between some of the fringe investigations of 19th century into telepathy and so on in terms of telematics and ideas of entanglement, effects that are non-local effects, and all those things we find in quantum science. So there was a certain agenda in 19th century epistemology which I think does get echoed in the world today. But I'd like to take the opportunity just to make a point about the interval, the 20th century, because actually though I've been castigating for polemical reasons the scientists this evening, if you look if you look at some of the things which were produced, for example, cybernetics, which has had very, very powerful effect, although it's unfashionable to talk about it as such now, on modern technology and science. It took an absolutely hard-nosed reductionist scientist, Heinz von Forster, to point out how the study of systems only makes sense if we become subjective in the study of them. That is, if we see that we are a system within the system that we're examining. And the second thing, of course, that Heinz von Forster said was that reality is constructed, and it's talking about consensual reality, which is, I guess, our way of getting through all the complications of the layers of reality and emptiness and fullness and so on which exist. So there's that. The second thing I would like to say apropos the abstract expressionists is that I would set not against, but alongside them, the minimalist thing, which I take to be a Western aesthetic way of talking about emptiness. If you look at some of the great architecture of the 20th century, it reads best if you're not in it, if you don't live in it, if you photograph it, if you image it, then you'll get the understanding of emptiness and stillness. I have to say that insight is thanks to my daughter's research at the moment, because she's looking at all of that. It's not out of my head. But when I look at what she's saying, I do understand there's a kind of metaphysic in absolutely extreme minimalistic architecture, for example. So anyway, I'm getting completely confused and lost and going off on my own tack here. But that's just a few thoughts that I have.
Could I say one thing to that? You said the power of abstract expression. And so I think that, that is the power maybe of the true expression. And you call it abstract expression because it's somehow not the controlled, normal, expected expression. So abstract expression to me is a beautiful thing, and that's what we maybe have lost and we need, The abstract expression is the true expression, in my opinion.
I think I totally agree with that. I think it's in my research on brain laterality, I come across this idea that we have this one hemisphere that seems to be specialized for coding information in terms of language, and language is particularly about what we already know, like our sort of ideas that we've developed about the world as it is, and we convey them with these symbols, so on and so forth. And then a whole other part of our brain seems to have remained so that it doesn't code that information in terms of language. It codes it in some other way, perhaps relatively more like in a raw, sort of true, sort of primary sort of form. And so it's this idea that we have these parallel perspectives of the world. One's constrained by what we already know through the lens of language, and one is not. And this idea that it's a very important thing to be able to have experience beyond the scope of our current sort of state of understanding of things. So this idea of abstract expression is sort of a way of trying to capture these insights and these sort of moments where we have this experience that we don't yet know how to configure into concrete, linearized, sort of language-based knowledge structures. So I agree completely that this sort of abstract insight is incredibly important, and it does sort of precede that we eventually sort of are able to mine out of that at some point these more technologically oriented kinds of ideas.
So you've got to give it to Pollock for providing the metaphor of networks and connectivity, interconnectedness, yeah? Pollock gives us that visual metaphor, I think, for a lot of the stuff that both Buddhists and physicists would be talking about, in my opinion.
Adam?
I was wondering if anyone on the panel could comment on the practical reality of cultivating a practice that promotes specialization, or the balance, harmony between specialization, whether it be spiritually or scientifically, artistically, and effectively integrating all those things together in this kind of an environment that we're talking about. Because, being a scientist or being an artist or being a spiritual practitioner, how do those three things balance with a finite amount of time and energy for any one individual to best manifest an integration of all those things, in your perspective?
Get used to poverty is the first thing.
Collaboration. You don't do it alone.
The first thing that pops into my mind is that, like, it seems pretty clear that, at least in Western society, that we spend the majority of our time in this sort of like analytical sort of doing mode. We're always sort of doing something. And being aware of that and trying to engage in an approach to your day-to-day experience that also incorporates this other sort of creative, just sort of more being state, it's just something one has to, I think, consciously make an effort to do, because the pressures of day-to-day living are such that they seem to almost, if not require, very much pressure us to be constantly in a doing sort of taskmaster kind of mode of operation. So if we subject ourselves to that, in my opinion, we're sort of like completely denying access to this whole other rich source of experience that is really an important part of the puzzle.
I just say the old saying, you know, before enlightenment, the guy was going to work every day, I don't know, working in a hamburger stand, coming home. And after enlightenment, he was going to the work every day to work in the hamburger stand and going home. And you got to make, you know, you still got to make $1, but that isn't. But the two states are different. So I don't think it's one or the other.
Speaking from Jim and my own personal perspective, we had a conversation with a group of medical doctors talking with physical scientists, and I was just questioning the idea of, with collaboration, with integration between things, the balance between really being a specialist in your own field, but also extending yourself to understand where the other person is coming from and understanding their aspects of it, so that you can effectively integrate. I mean, you can't just put three things in a pot and stir it together and say that they're integrated just because they're all next to each other.
Can I answer that question? I think it's about friendship. I really do. If you're a scientist or an astrophysicist and we talk as friends in a cafe, we'll be able to work together. But if we just come to work together from our separate disciplines, it's missing out the whole human aspect, the fact that we like each other as people and want to spend time together. So it's really about, I feel strongly about this actually, it's about creating environments where people have an opportunity to be friends, to exchange on a human level, and the disciplines are just these wonderful knowledge experiences that start merging and being exchanged, and the language you learn. So if you're in a marriage with a person with another language, you learn the language. In fact, they suggest that the best way to learn a language is to get a friend or a boyfriend or girlfriend who doesn't speak your language, because you really want to communicate to that person through your heart. And then it just becomes slowly a way where both learn each other's language. So this whole disciplinary practice of putting people together artificially is impossible and is wrong. And it really creates a lot of friction and gaps and misunderstandings. And really, people who are here are all somehow connected. It's not artificial. So it's not just out of the mind, oh, let's put these elements together and see what happens. A lot of disciplinary collaboration in university settings are totally artificial. There's a grant for this and that, and people come together, do the grant, and then they go back off into their little disciplinary fiefdoms. So it's a big problem. I think it's a problem that's educational, and within the academic context, it's as if we live in a kind of a Balkan state where everybody's got their fiefdoms, and education cannot even mention spirituality. It's somehow not a scientific method that's accepted. And so the human element and the spiritual element is completely deleted 99% of the time out of an educational system. So this is the problem. And I think for me as an artist, being in the university is strange to start with, but since I'm here, I'm exploring, and I just feel so, I sit here and watch and listen, and I just feel I'm so blessed, I'm so amazed that I'm in this room with these incredible people coming together, speaking their minds and giving us their opinion. Everybody here. We're changing each other's minds by sharing these experiences. And I'm particularly amazed that Rinpoche and Phunto and Losang are here because they're at the end of their tour. They're going back to India on Monday. So we're really, really lucky to have them here. And the conversations and the teachings we got from them really show the scientific basis of Buddhism, and that it is very much a philosophy, and how through this tragedy of what happened in Tibet in 1959, somehow by some karmic reason that I certainly don't understand, they were dispersed all over the world, and they're trying to help this absolutely horrible situation that we're in collectively. And we're in this time when in 1969, for the first time ever, we saw our planet. We saw our planet from the moon. We never had that perception of ourselves. We have the internet, only 20 years do we have it really. And with television, and I mean, just our minds are changing, and the reactionary forces don't want that. And so the clashes and the destruction is horrendous. The only way we can really try to do anything is to come together and think about our intent, our motivations, and just the simple truths that are beyond the complex Tibetan practices or the complex nanotechnological or neuroscientific practices or technoethics or the global awareness. It sounds so intimidating on some level, but in the end you sit there and you realize, you know, it's just about being human and not wanting to destroy, but to co-create, to be here and try to evolve each other collectively. So it's wonderful to have you here, and I really, really thank you all for being here, and for all of you sitting here for so long. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.